So a common theme with game journalists that you may have realized, and I have realized many times, is that basically if something is good, and if gamers like something, journos are not allowed to like it. Hence, no microtransactions in Star Wars Squadrons is actually a bad thing. Because we were complaining about EA's microtransactions for years and years and years, and now that we have what we want, it's actually a bad thing, guys. You're dumb because you're not a game journalist. And full disclosure, I haven't played Star Wars Squadrons. I've never really been into flight simulators or air combat games like that. It looks interesting, it looks pretty, but I haven't played it. But that shouldn't matter because this whole video and this whole discussion has nothing to do with the game itself. It has to do with the fact that apparently EA showing restraint with microtransactions and DLC practices. Apparently that's a bad thing now. Hello, angry gamer who remembers when you could spend $60 and get the entire game and no one asked you to pay for DLC or loot boxes or battle passes. Yes, apparently if you remember when paying for the game once was a thing, you are an angry gamer. We're starting off super strong. EA heard your complaints and has delivered what you've been asking for. A complete game with no microtransactions, no in-game currency, absolutely no post-purchase monetization whatsoever. And it's not the first time they've done this. Jedi Fallen Order, Battlefront 2 post-rework, like EA's been changing their business strategy. I'm not saying they're good guys now, but to act like Squadrons is the first time that they've done this would just be wrong. And that's also why this article is so funny to me. They're saying that, oh, this game it's a bad thing. It's a bad thing. It's not going to last, that EA has not been putting microtransactions in Star Wars games, as we're on the third non-Predator, or I guess second and a half if you count Battlefront 2 post-rework. But my point is, the entire thesis of this article is that these no DLC games from EA are going to fail, and then we're going to get DLC back. And that can just be countered by the fact that you're just wrong. Because Fallen Order exists. Because Battlefront 2 was reworked. If you want new weapons for your ship or new cosmetic items for your pilot, you have to play the game and earn them. You got what you wanted, but at what cost? No cost, because there's no DLC. Or microtransactions. God forbid I want to actually work for the things in a game that I paid for. Like, what world do we live in where it's a bad thing, where a game expects you to play it? The AAA landscape has irrevocably changed, and while Squadrons lets you relive your X-Wing vs. TIE Fighter glory days from 1997 free of microtransactions, the reality is that the game will ultimately suffer for it in the long run. I love this. We started the article by saying, you miss the old days of when you could pay for a game once and that was the end of it. But now, it's a bad thing that you paid for the game once. Like, do you want to keep paying for the game? If you want to have a conversation about the amount of content in this game, that's fine. If you want to have a conversation about whether or not microtransactions are justified, that's fine. But you're doing neither. You're just criticizing the idea that people don't want to keep continuously paying for the same game over and over again. If any game was going to go for a nostalgia play in 2020, it makes sense that it would be Squadrons. The core Star Wars fan base is of an age bracket that happens to intersect with anyone that has ever owned and operated a joystick. I was born in 1997. I would consider myself part of the Star Wars fan base. This is another thing that I've noticed with a lot of game journalists. Whenever Star Wars does something that they like, they say, oh, Star Wars is for everyone. Whenever Star Wars does something that gets criticism, they say, oh, Star Wars fans are all old. Like, stop it. Those 90s LucasArts games like Rebel Assault and Rogue Squadron are still considered masterpieces by many. Squadrons is clearly going for a particular audience, one that still vehemently opposes microtransactions. The people that oppose microtransactions aren't just gamers from the 90s. Like I said, I was born in 97. I was brought up on, like, the late Nintendo 64 and then into the PS2 and GameCube era. And also, I'm just a person with a brain and respect for my own money. So, I don't like microtransactions. Why are you trying to put labels on every kind of person who might play this game? Just talk about the game. Unfortunately, for those of us that either keep up with the times or blindly follow corporations like Lemmings, which is where you seem to fall, Squadrons comes to us with far less content and perhaps longevity than we've come to expect from modern games. It isn't much of a leap assume that the lack The lack of monetization in the game goes hand in hand with the lack of future support. Well, to go back to a point that you made, people asked EA to make games without DLC, without microtransactions. Just let us pay once for the game and that's the stuff. And we have that now. Again, I don't know much about Squadrons. I don't know if there's a content problem, but also EA said there's not going to be microtransactions or DLC. They didn't say there's going to be no updates at all. And if we've learned anything from Battlefront 2 and Fallen Order, it's that EA is completely willing to do a bunch of free updates and content drops for games if they think that it will have a lasting buyer's appeal. You seem to be forgetting that DLC and microtransactions and battle passes, these aren't the only ways that games can be improved post-launch. In fact, most of the time it's not like that. I don't know what EA's plan is with Squadrons, but I can guarantee you they're not just going to drop the game and then say fuck it and walk away. That's never going to happen. EA knows there's money to be made by releasing a good product with one price tag. They know there is money in that. Because if the game is good with one price tag and people continue to talk about it, the game will continue to sell. That's how these things work. For years, we've been told that loot boxes and battle passes support the games we play and allow the developers to continue creating new content. And most of the time, that is a lie, because we've also seen an uptick in the last few years of content that has been in the game since launch but is locked behind a paywall and then sold later as DLC. I have no doubt in my mind that DLC and microtransactions for these always online games, for these multiplayer focused games, absolutely they support the continued development of the game. But that doesn't mean it's not a system that's being abused, and it's not a system people are tired of because it's so transparently being abused. With no monetization, isn't it reasonable to assume the game won't have any post-launch support? That's how all games worked back in the day. There were no patches, no seasonal events, and no fresh content. Is Launch Squadrons the final version of Squadrons? I love this. That's how all games worked back in the day. No patches, no events. Like, that's literally not true. You're acting like patches and seasonal events for online games. You're acting like that's a brand new concept that only came around like in a post-Fortnite world. And I even just Googled Star Wars Squadrons update, and there's a whole bunch of stories about upcoming patches and new bonuses, new ranking systems. Like, again, I don't know shit about this game, but it's being updated. This is information readily available to you. For a multiplayer PvP game, that would be a death sentence. Yeah, that's why it's not happening. A player base needs fresh content to stay healthy. Maybe the nostalgia crowd will have their fun and move on, and EA will be satisfied with the game's ROI, and that will be it. I think that would be a shame, frankly. Okay, you seem to be conflating two different things. Earlier you said this was a game that you pay once for and that was the end of it. Now you're saying that this is a multiplayer PvP game that needs to be updated. Which one is it? There's nothing wrong with either one of those, but they also need to be held to different standards. And also, even if it is a multiplayer PvP only game, which it's just not, it's single player and multiplayer, that doesn't, even if it was a multiplayer only game, that doesn't mean you have to continuously pay for it. I mean, I can think of a bunch of games off the top of my head that you would never have to put any money into if you didn't want to. Apex Legends, Valorant, Counter-Strike, Team Fortress 2, Dota, League of Legends. And then you have the paid multiplayer games that you can pay once for, like Siege and PUBG. Like, have you just not been paying attention to the landscape of things recently? It might have to be that way though. Suppose Squadrons has a ton of awesome support for the next few years, new maps, new game modes, new cosmetics to unlock. How are we going to feel the next time we're asked to buy a battle pass? It wouldn't be in EA's best interest to support Squadrons with new content. You're trying to make an argument that just doesn't really make sense. Is this a game you pay once for? Or is this a game that needs to be supported? EA has already made it very clear that they're not going to add microtransactions or DLC to it. Now, do I trust EA's word on that? Absolutely not. I would never trust EA's word on anything. But they have made it pretty clear what their intention with this game is. This sounds like another case of game journalism being just instinctively opposed to something that people want. And if you seriously don't think a Star Wars game could support itself on sales alone, again, Jedi Fallen Order, Battlefront 2 post-rework, and then pretty much every game from before EA took over. This is not a new concept. For what it's worth, I hope Squadrons has a strong player base for years to come. I'm having a blast with it and would love to make it part of my multiplayer rotation, but I also know that if it doesn't have a big seasonal event to bring a mass of players back every once in a while, there simply won't be any players at all sooner rather than later. I don't want microtransactions to be some kind of necessary evil, but at this point it's pretty evident they are, at least for match-made games. You are just wrong. If anything has been learned in the last few years, it's that microtransactions are not a necessary evil. They're often there. Their presence has been greatly decreasing in recent months, but they're not a necessary evil. The industry as a whole is starting to rotate back around to, oh, if we make a good game that you pay once for, people will continue to buy it and it will spread through word of mouth. And then we can have maybe some optional microtransactions that are in the background. I think that's a better system for everybody. Like, you do realize that a lot of really successful games are just single player with no DLC or no post-launch microtransactions. Like, I can think of plenty right off the top of my head that don't do that. Or if they do DLC, it's very, infrequent drops, big substantial drops that are completely optional. Gaming is massive. EA is massive. Star Wars is massive. If you don't think these things can support themselves on a single game price, you are a fool. Don't buy into what they tell you. Pun intended. Don't buy into this whole narrative they say. They're like, oh, we need these things. Single player games just aren't what people want. We need microtransactions. They literally do not. Do I understand microtransactions? Yes. Do I understand that a lot of microtransactions will maybe add more content to a game because of the more support? Yes. But is there something inherently wrong or negative with a game where you pay once? No. Quit damage controlling for EA.